Right. Well, here we are. So we get to talk about things that are getting us excited in mining or in other areas.
Whatever the heck it is. It's up every day these days, right?
I feel like there's plenty of content. So, it's just sort of where we launch off from, but you're always doing something exciting. So, what's getting you excited at the very moment?
Well, frankly, right now I'm really excited about my latest lip gloss find.
Oh, tell me more.
Buxom. I don't know if you have this one. Yeah, for all
No?
of our listeners, yeah, it's like a lip plumper one that when you're doing podcasts and all of these things, right? I'm like, I need to look
Yeah.
like I'm, not just rolled out of bed. So yeah, I'll send you the link. But
Right. I'm
very
gonna need
excited. It travels well, which has been important because yeah, I've been spending a lot of time in Guyana for the
that.
last, gosh, almost 6 months. So that's been a lot of fun because with my consulting company, Global Venture, we've been working with the government of Guyana to do like a national scale mineral mapping program. So we wrapped up the first phase in December, and then we're getting ready to kick off the second phase. And it's just so neat because, first of all, very few countries are dedicating resources to that scale of investment in mining, right? Where they're willing to go out and do kind of the baseline work, the early stage exploration work and geophysics and stuff like that to facilitate, you know, really high quality companies being interested to come in. So it's really cool to do that. Again, that's kind of like how my career really started in mining with first Iraq and then Afghanistan. But there are much better cocktails in Guyana. So it's much more of it's not a dry country. That's a benefit.
I was
Like
gonna
that.
say, I feel like the cocktails in some of those other locations just don't exist.
Yeah. I mean, you were allowed to bring up to 2 bottles of liquor in from duty free as an American. So, that's part of you had to like manage that for whatever you wanted to bring in.
Yeah.
But Anna has great rum. So that's been fun to diversify from my bourbon habit. But yeah, it's just been really neat. Even some of your guests that I know you've had on, like Tyler Hall, like this program, it's allowed me to work with the government and craft a program that integrates really cutting edge stuff
Yeah.
into the like regional or national scale exploration program and do it with companies that maybe are just starting or they have a lot of promise, but they're not like the names and companies that everyone's familiar with. And of course, having worked in like the mining tech startup space myself for a while now, like I know what that can mean and also the value that those companies bring and those teams bring that are doing really cool brand new stuff and delivering and they want to make it work so bad because this is what they're really passionate about. So that's been a lot of fun and everybody in Guyana has been so much fun to work with. Great people, super smart people. So yeah, I'm just really enjoying that.
Well, as you mentioned, I think something that I have found really, really interesting is that there is so much new, interesting tech. And I find that often when I'm talking to entrepreneurs who have an exploration background, say like Tyler, for them to break into the industry, they have to have something as a case study or that's proven. And so the ability to do stuff like that in Guyana would be really awesome. And it sounds like you're sort of leveraging some of that so that perhaps others can get a leaping off point as well, which I love.
Well, it's like we talk all the time, even especially at Prospector, about how, the industry, if we want to be different, we have to do different, right? We have to approach things differently, use new innovative technology. You've got to budget in a certain level of do something different risk, right? If the whole industry is gonna evolve and change. We see that every day on the prospector side, certainly with AI and building tools for companies, but mining is such a risk adverse industry. That's how we keep people safe. That's how we keep the environment safe. That's how we keep investors' money safe, right? It's so counterintuitive in a way because the whole industry is basically built to have zero risk.
Yep.
And yet, if you want to incorporate innovation and new tools, like then where do you put that, right? It totally doesn't fit into a normal kind of process for even an exploration company. Because how do you go justify you only raised $2 million to go drill? How do you justify taking any percentage of that and putting it towards something new that people consider,
Right.
right? How do you justify that to shareholders?
Well, it is really hard to prove that to shareholders, but I think that, I mean, I know that you and I probably are in concert about this, but I think mining is an inherently risky industry. And so then we try to de-risk it, as you said, by removing all of those layers of uncertainty. But how far has that gotten us, right? Like it's taken us forever to get things to move forward in so many instances. And so there is inherent risk in doing things the same way forever. And so it could also be de risking by trying something new and just giving other people the opportunity to then say, oh, hey, this actually works, or there's another option, or exploration doesn't have to just be done in this way to be successful. In fact, we'll have different data, we'll have different information, we'll have different thoughts and counter perspectives if we start incorporating some alternatives in there. And to me, that's what gets me excited, right? Like everyone I've talked to that's been either on our show or that I'm talking to from a recruiting perspective, what gets you excited and out of bed every day is not doing the same thing over and over and over again, right? And that's monotony and that's insanity. And so I think that right now we have such an opportunity and a stage really to think differently, to do differently, because we have all this pressure to figure out how we're going to get the minerals and the things that we need domestically, right? And so 27 years from exploration phase to getting it out of the ground isn't going to cut it.
Yeah.
So we've got to do something differently.
Yeah, and I think that's where the way I see it, at least from like a tech integration perspective, I think to properly like maybe diagnose the problem, right?
Yeah.
Because I think it's hard to just completely change everything because everybody says they want it done differently, they want innovation, but yet it doesn't happen, right? There's this huge disconnect because people say all these things, including the people who should be authorized to do those things differently, right? They all talk about it, and yet nothing really seems to happen, right? Which is confusing if you're
Yeah.
somebody who, is building an innovation and tech company, right? And I'm being, kind of generalizing, right? Of
Yeah.
course, things are happening and there's progress, but not to the level that you hear people marketing the fact that they want it. And I think the challenge is when you look at the big companies, which are really the companies that have the budget to set aside to do things differently, right? Because they're producing, right? They have producing assets.
Yeah.
So they're the ones that have some of the money to invest in this. But because they also have producing assets, they're running mines, which essentially are things that were planned decades ago and have been running in some cases for decades in a certain way, and they have to be run in a certain way because of legacy infrastructure, because of permits, because of the way they were financed. Like there's all these justifications for why an operating mine in particular has to focus on like incremental change, right? Like the very good reasons for why that is. Although I would say I started my career within IBM's supply chain management consulting group, and I used to have to do Lean Six Sigma stuff all the time, right? And I'm like, if they can figure out how to repair the B-52 engine cowling for the Air Force differently, right? We could probably tweak how we do mining operations differently too, right?
Yeah.
But I think that mindset in the big companies trickles into even how they approach exploration because the big companies in reality don't really do exploration anymore, right? Just buy
Yeah.
earlier stage projects and companies.
Yeah.
So they're not even really having to figure out how to appropriately take exploration risk and invest in stuff that benefits that side. They can just sit there and wait for the perfect project to show up and then they just buy it,
Yeah.
right? So we keep pushing all of that innovation risk onto the smaller and mid-cap companies who already have less money to put towards that stuff, right? So I think that's where the problem is
Yeah.
the risk for innovation is not being pushed onto the folks who can actually take the risk, right? And it's, again, everyone's in it to make money. So somehow you've got to be able to make more money by taking more risk.
Well, and I agree with you. And I think clearly we've seen sort of like the exploration component be outsourced ultimately, right? And I think even in the time that I've spent in the mining industry in the last really 20 years, the majors have just gotten even bigger and bigger. And their threshold for risk and what they push down onto the others to assume that risk, as you said, continues to sort of evolve as well. It'd be really interesting. And I think we're starting to see some of these accelerators and innovation sort of think tanks and other things kind of come up. But like, again, to subsidize that cost into some of the majors that say, this is a great technology. We will subsidize that cost or use that so that you can go be successful on our behalf. That would short circuit sort of this everybody chasing their tail to get money from all of these different directions every single, conference season or, every 6 months when they need to refund themselves because it's really hard to be hand to mouth and still find innovation, right? And so to me, that's absolutely prohibitive. And it's amazing to find individuals who thrive in that environment, right? Because there are so many of them that continue to figure out how to make it work. But I just
Well,
wonder
and
how many other things haven't worked in the last 5 years when we've been underfunded in the junior market.
yeah, and then people assume that because a project didn't work or a junior went under, it's not necessarily because the asset was bad, right? It could be one of the things you just listed, right? It could just be, and I don't think that the industry is good at recognizing or evaluating projects at that level. I think we still operate in this I got a guy mindset where
Mhm.
there are feeders essentially. There are juniors that are feeders into certain mid tiers or certain majors, and it's a lot that is based off of who you've worked for before. And there's a lot of value in that, there can be, but it also leaves a lot of really good stuff on the table, right? And it means that there's a lot of missed opportunities because someone isn't in that clique, right? But it's pretty clear when you look at kind of how projects get acquired and when you look back at how those people are connected in the past, that, oh, I've got a great geologist. I just look at whatever he or she brings me, right? Well, okay, what makes that person a way better geologist? Just the fact that they've been able to bring you 3 projects, but that's because you had the door open for them,
Yeah.
right? There have been 3 or 4 other geologists who are even better that just couldn't get into your office because they don't know you already, right?
Well, and I think that that happens a lot. And I guess that brings me to two specific thoughts. Well, maybe three. What I love about Prospector is that you can trace that you have all of this capability in there to say who's on the board and who's doing what and understand sort of how these webs are mixing together and what projects are out there and all of that stuff. And so, one, I think it's great for a research standpoint, but two, then look at alternatives, right? And say, this is all of the stuff that I've been missing, and then perhaps use your favorite geologist to go out and create relationships or go look at some alternative things. I think that Prospector is great for that. And I'll let you comment on that. But then the second area that I'm thinking of is that there are so many juniors out there that just don't know how to tell the story
Yeah.
and they can't that the needle is not moving when you just put out drill results or when you say the same thing or when you've got your one pager at all of these conferences. So talking about what we do differently, don't even get me started there. And I lost number three somewhere in the midst of all of that.
But I think, and that's where I personally believe that we are overdue for just a completely different investment slash financing model for the industry. I just think the way that it's set up right now, you can't get out of that pattern. Frankly, like it doesn't even matter if you're a junior who does tell a great story, because I know some of those folks too, and they still struggle,
Yeah.
right? They can tell the story, they've got a great team, they, have a really compelling narrative, even outside of the technical stuff, and they still are having a hard time. And that's just because there's so little money to go around. They're all fighting for the same money, right? I think what we need is really like a venture capital type system to come in. You look at why VC works for tech. Despite my own, I've got a whole list of, issues that I would have with the VC space out of Silicon Valley. But one thing that it does really well is you have a group of investors who acknowledge, I'm going to put money into 100 different companies, and if one of them hits, it's going to pay for all of them,
Yeah.
right? And so there's this acknowledgement that you're putting money into stuff that's super early, it's not yet de-risked, but you're kind of doing that investment to kind of keep this early stage, high risk industry alive because every once in a while you get a unicorn,
Yeah.
right? And that has, it has worked to create a lot of innovation in the space. And I think that's where on the mining side, we don't have, well, we've got maybe what, like 5 funds that do stuff like that in mining. And a lot of them aren't even doing like early stage exploration stuff. They're looking for mining technology on the processing side. They're looking for, companies going into operations, right? So at some point, I think that's what the industry needs is a bunch of rich people to get
Yeah.
together and say, we're going to do essentially a venture fund for early stage exploration, right? And we're going to jump in and we're going to take risk for everybody.
Well, I agree. I think that we need something like that. And, sort of like rising tide floats all boats, right? And it's giving the opportunity for some of this space to do better with less and share that
Right,
risk and do something that we're inherently have been inherently poor at in the mining industry, which is collaborate, right?
right.
Everybody, it's sort of like the race to the finish. Who do you know? You got the money before the next person. And that's been a self-defeating scenario, I think, for the mining industry. And I think now there are big problems to solve. We've got to figure out how to get resources domestically. We have to figure out how to produce them. We have to figure out how to use them better, but telling the story outside of the silo that we are probably one of the more critical aspects, right? Because how do we generate a venture capital fund to even have interest in us if we're not talking about the critical nature of what we do and what it contributes to in a better way? And I think that that's the part that we need to be focusing on. And it's a hard story to tell. I mean, it's a big vision, and to get anybody to latch onto it without, being opponents. I think Julie Lucas does a really great job of figuring out how to talk to individuals. I think that we're all doing it, but we're still just talking to one another in so many instances.
Well, and I think personally that you've got a lot of individuals who are out there trying to do that
Yeah.
because it's the right thing to do. Certainly, I know you and I and a handful of folks at least where I know it's like, it's not like it makes us any more money.
No,
And that's
not
the
yet.
problem. Yeah, it's like, yeah.
Waiting.
So where's the big check, right?
Yeah.
For changing the face of mining and,
Yeah.
like, where's the big check? But I think, at some point, it again, that's where the folks who have the money have to decide that they're going to get behind folks that are willing to do that. I mean, and what I always think back on is I was doing a long round of pitches to VC groups about Prospector, right? And I probably talked over 2 months to well over 100 companies, right?
Yeah.
Well over 100 groups that are, again, investing and had agreed to the meeting, right? So tech company focused on mining, that was kind of what they understood. There were, and from counting back, there were only 4 or 5 of them who had ever talked to anybody who even remotely touched mining. And usually, even once they said that, they were like, yeah, and I originally took the meeting with those people because I thought it was like Bitcoin mining. They were doing like rock stuff. You're really only the second person I've talked to that does rock stuff with technology. I'm like, so that's incredible, right? Like, so
Yeah.
when you think about it, like all of these folks looking for money in the industry, first of all, we go public so early, way too early compared to everybody else in the industry, right? You talk about the junior mining industry going, having these small micro cap companies, like there's no other industry like that. Tech companies don't go public with those types of numbers, right? I mean, it's a very unique ecosystem in that way. So if you were to say, okay, think for a minute that you're going to stay private. Who are you pitching to? Everybody's pitching to like high net worth individuals, retail mining investors, and mining funds. Nobody's going to New York, you know, Silicon Valley. Nobody's talking to VC groups or private equity or anything like that, right? And it's like, why not?
Yeah.
Right? They're gonna tell you no. I can tell you. Like most of them are gonna say no, but they also mostly say no to everybody, right?
Yeah.
Like so you got to get it out there, get some new money into that ecosystem and tell and it does force you to then tell the story differently, right? And
Yeah.
that's where even kind of, groups or mining companies that are considered not even necessarily mining companies, but like the deep sea companies, like they've got
Yeah.
to tell a completely different story
Yeah.
than, an onshore nickel
Yeah.
project, right? They have to because it's so different. The space mining companies have to tell a completely different story, right? So I think there's a lot to learn from those groups that are tied to the industry but not making up the core of it as to how have they managed to get money. Like how
Yeah.
did you get people to give you money to go mine an asteroid for platinum? How did you get money to go pick up deep sea nodules? I find that fascinating and like so much that we can learn from for the rest of the industry.
Well, it is fascinating, right? But like, it's also in knowing what I know about mining, all of those options, right, seem so much more risky than having an open pit copper project in your backyard. And
Of
so,
who are willing to take more risk. It's
yep,
our investors who
yep,
don't want to take the risk. It's
yep,
it's current mining investment capital
yep,
that wants to keep investing the way it's always invested.
yep,
There's lots of other money out there in the world that is clearly willing to throw money at companies that don't even make a profit, don't even make a product, like don't even get me started on like crypto things, right? Like people put money into stuff all the time that makes absolutely no sense to me.
Yep. Right.
Clear pathway to revenue or profit, and yet they all get funded, you
Yeah.
know?
Well, and one of the things that I try to look at in my clients and with others that I have the opportunity to work with is, you know, when you attract talent, it's almost the same thing as attracting investment, right? So if you're not telling a compelling narrative as to why and what the vision is and what it does and all of those amazing things. I mean, asteroid mining, deep sea mining, like that's a big vision. That's a lot of risk, but it's a big vision. And the bigger the vision and the more you can sell it and the more you can get people like part of it that are also doing it. So like, we talk about values, we talk about all these things. If companies were talking about those sorts of things, people invest emotionally all the time. They could just
Right.
like a brand logo. They could just like what the person is saying. And so creating this bigger, broader idea of what it is that we do and talking about that not only creates a sort of a vacuum to suck in new talent, it, I think, would also aid in our ability to bring in money from alternative sources. Because just like you said, we keep going to the same pool and then they're reinforcing the same models that we've used forever. And so bringing in alternative thoughts, ideas, investment, et cetera, I'm like, this is obviously the solution, people. Let's just get to it.
And I think what's key to that is true leadership,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's where also when you look at the bulk of the industry, people get to an executive level by being really good managers. And that's
Mhm.
not the same thing as being a really good leader, right?
Yep.
And they're both super, super important, right?
Yeah.
And especially for a mining company, good management is critical. But that's what you owe. It's so I pay attention when I'm hearing a company pitch or do their spiel. How often do they say, and here's our leadership team
Yeah.
versus how often do they say, here's our management team, right?
Interesting.
Because I think it's even just in the way that you're thinking about it. Are you managing an asset or are you leading a company?
Yeah.
Those are two very different things,
Yeah.
right? And again, both super valuable. You can't have a really, a company that scales and grows and makes money if you're not managing it properly. But if you're trying to, paint a big vision and you're trying to get like a group of non-traditional folks to come in and do something different, like doing something different requires leadership, right? It
Yes.
requires rallying people to some kind of cry that they're going to get behind you and race off into the unknown and take a bunch of risk and take on challenges they've never done before. And I think that's somewhere where within the industry, we don't have a ton of folks that are leading in that way, right? And it's not a knock on individuals, but it's very much like a charisma, a vision, and being able to tell a story and rally people behind you.
Well, and to speak to that point, Emily, I feel like when you have a really strong leadership team, often they'll stick together, right? And they may have an asset be purchased by whomever else because they've had a vision and they've had management of that asset so that it's successful because they've had strong leadership and vision. And then they go off and they do the same thing, right? And so I think that when we have strong leadership, that it could almost be applied to any different area. Like you could have a company that then went to a variety of ideas, whether it's tech in mining, whether it's an actual exploration project, and then you just bring in technical experts. And with that strong vision and leadership, you can all be successful together. And I think often when we see that failure of leadership, that we have a company managing a process, an asset, a technology, a whatever, and they have all of these technical great contributors with a lack of anything else. And that's where I think we see things stall out. And I hadn't thought about when they talk about leadership versus management. So I'm going to have to start like going through all of the websites and seeing what they call it. Sometimes it's just our team, right? But
Yeah, right. And sometimes they distinguish, but then it's also, I always find it interesting, like, how do they articulate who is on the leadership team
yeah,
versus your people, right? Who does your company consider leadership,
yeah,
right? And, usually it's like the board. It's like, really? Like, I mean, yes, absolutely. But, and I'm sure there are good reasons for that, some type of dictionary definition. But having worked in other industries, right, and having spent a lot of time in particular in and around the military, for as an example, right? As well as the development space, right? The folks that do international development. There are ways that other industries and other groups manage how you do this that we can learn from. And part of it is I think our industry has to be willing to recruit from outside, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of other industries, they kind of cross-populate and recognize that sometimes it's time for a company to have a new voice, right? Somebody from outside to come in and fix the issues, that you
Yep.
can't always just fix the issues through pulling in someone who did the same thing in the same copper project in the same country, right?
Yep.
Like I don't think our country, our industry does a really good job of recognizing that either. Like there is not, I don't see there as being a great accountability cycle for that,
Yep.
right? And that can go across a whole bunch of different things, but the same group just kind of gets recycled over and over, and they might leave one company and go on the board of another company, and then 2 years back, 2 years later, they popped up over here, right?
Yep.
And it's like, well, part of why people don't want to invest in mining is because, they keep losing money,
Yep.
right? So why are you using the same people over and over again if they keep making decisions that are losing investors' money? Like, I totally sympathize and acknowledge that that's a very legitimate concern that people have about putting money into the sector,
Yep.
right? Just keep making the same mistakes over and over again.
It's interesting on the recruiting side because often I'll have a company come and say, Lindsey, we need a COO, and they have to have experience in this country with this asset, with this kind of ore body, and they have to be a good leader and manager and speak this language. And like by the time we get the wish list done,
Yeah, like,
there are like three people to choose from. And they probably know those three people, right? And I mean, there could be more than three, but I'm going to go with, we're weeding that pool down so significantly. And and if they've done it in somewhere else, they perhaps they don't want to be there again, or maybe they want to do something differently, or, but then they're pigeonholed. And so sometimes we typecast what we need and who can do it so squarely that like it just doesn't work anymore. And when they're out of options, that's when they come to me, right? Like we went to those three people because we
oh,
were right, we
goodness.
knew them, and now we need to think differently. And so it's sort of like the conversation then has to go like, what are the concessions you're willing to make? What are the areas that you might gain from getting somebody that hasn't worked in this area? What are the risks of having somebody who hasn't worked in this area, but perhaps has worked somewhere else that's way crazier, which, mining is a global scenario. And so, like, if somebody's worked in Africa and they speak Spanish, can they go work in Mexico and transfer those skills? Probably, right? Like, why would that be a weed out? But you would be surprised how often we have to adhere to like the absolute must have list versus looking at like an entire package. And this is where I absolutely get on a soapbox because I'm like, you have to have a different philosophy on how to treat people and the leadership and what they can bring to it and who else you might capture because you have somebody very different leading your organization. And we err on the safe side or what we think it is more often than not. And that continues to leave us with the three people that we started with in the first place, and then figuring out ways to pay them more, which dilutes everything and makes investors question it and all the rest of it and inflates everything else up. So that's my soapbox. But, there are a lot of really interesting options out there.
Yeah, and it happens even at the employee level because I've had several conversations as I was putting the team together for Guyana, right? And we've got a great team there, but talked to several people who are like, well, I've only ever really worked in West Africa. And I'm like, well, the geology of West Africa is actually really similar to the
Yeah.
geology of Guyana because they used to be together back, pre the whole ocean thing, like as a geologist, like I can make that work, I
Yeah.
can, it's like, I don't care that most people have never worked in Guyana. There's a really
Yeah.
small pool of folks and they're great too. But like, yeah, that's kind of why, we've got to go bring in a new crop of folks to get experience working there. But so even at that level, it's like most people limit themselves to, well, I've only ever worked in this type of mine. I've only ever worked in this type of geology or this country or for this company and this size of company, right? So it happens the other way too, which keeps folks from really building out a diverse experience and skill set,
Yeah.
right? So I think it definitely goes both ways. Whereas I'm kind of like, man, I'll go work wherever, sounds like fun and there's cool stuff to do, right? But I think that's where it has to happen from both sides. But
Yeah.
it's absolutely true what you're saying about the narrow profile, and that's how you end up with what I always like to joke is PMS, pale, male, and stale,
Yep.
right? Like that you're going to get
Yep.
the same people, and they may be great people and extremely qualified, but if the industry is serious about wanting to have different ideas and different things going on, then somebody's going to have to take the chance, right? Someone's going to have to try opening it up.
Well, I think, one of the areas that I have started to think more about is that we have obviously an aging population within the mining industry, but, beyond that as well. So we have a lot of people who are going to be and who have started retiring or just going to board work or whatever and functionally getting out of the day-to-day stuff. So that's created opportunity for, let's go with an age range from 40 to 55 roughly, to upskill into leadership, executive management, C-suite, board roles, et cetera. There are far fewer in that population than there were in the individuals who are looking at making an exit or moving towards retirement. And often they've been pigeonholed or typecast, as we said, into any really specifically technical area. The ones that I tend to work the most with are those who are like you, who are sort of a generalist and say, like, cool, let's go do this, figure it out. Perhaps I fail, perhaps I don't like it, perhaps this is a non-starter, but I've learned something, I've gotten a different, skill set, I've broadened my network, whatever that case might be. And now I can go apply those lessons in something else, right? And so I love working with that generalist population. But in looking at that, we have to be able to upskill those who have been typecast into really technical roles so that they can be strong leaders, so that they can go into organizations and make waves and make a difference. Because there are far fewer people to choose from. We need to work with the generalists to figure out how do we utilize those skill sets in the best possible way to make these organizations move forward. So for me, how do we upskill? How do we train? How do we do an MBA without doing an MBA? These are all the questions that I'm thinking of in the background so that we can have really robust leadership teams in our mining industry, while perhaps doing that, we then attract outsiders in who have very different perspectives, because there is no better time than to start thinking about this than now. Because if we start thinking about it again in 5 years when there are far fewer to choose from, we're pretty screwed.
I wonder, Lindsay, do folks, you and I have talked a lot about at some point, I'm really passionate about creating a, as I like to call, mill to mine pathway, right? For folks coming out of the military to work in our industry, because I think there's just so much crossover and so many opportunities to create a great, workforce pool with folks that are really probably going to be very comfortable with many of the parts of the industry that other groups might see as a negative, right? And they would probably really thrive in it. And I know, so when I'm talking to my friends that are retiring out or getting out of the military, and they talk to me about transitioning, because my husband's former military, we have so many friends that have transitioned, like, what advice do you have? What I always tell them is look for a company that has some type of a like tour of duty leadership program. And IBM used to have this. And that's actually how I led IBM's like recruiting for undergrad and graduate stuff for the public sector supply chain practice for a year, right? Had no recruiting experience. I was super young, right? Because they had this program where you would do tours of duty in other parts of the company in order to do exactly what you said, right? So that as you moved up, you'd have experience knowing how do you manage your recruitment pipeline for your projects to match up and like all these different things. Like I actually don't know. I know companies like Battelle, because some of my friends have gone into that. Some of the bigger engineering construction firms do. I know like pharmaceuticals and tech companies have that. Do mining companies have
The
leadership
short answer to that is not often. There are a few groups, so Freeport probably being one of them, that identifies individuals for a leadership or management track, who then
programs?
try to sort of like cross-pollinate, right, and give them exposure to various areas. This was an activity predating me that Phelps Dodge did really well for a number of years. And I think others that were majors at the time that were smaller than they are now. But, many individuals that my dad had the opportunity to work with and recruit, and that I sort of learned about throughout my youth and then my entry point into mining, they had that. But then we had so many cycles and scared people off, and it just became, rather than a opportunity center, it became a cost center. And so in trying to figure out how to do more with less, they got rid of it. And so I don't think that we do that well in the mining industry. I think that it absolutely needs to come back, because having and it's just like individuals who work in juniors or mid tiers and smaller organizations. It's like I always joke with them, like, when you do your job well, you're rewarded with more work. You get to wear more hats. Like, there's less of a team. Like, all of a sudden you're a generalist and you have all these opportunities and experience. It's a great thing, versus going and being a cog in the wheel with whatever, if you're going to do, like, you're forever doing GIS, like, oh gosh, like that might get a little dull. And that's when we see individuals move out of larger organizations and say, I want to do something else. But then it's really hard to give them that opportunity because they haven't yet. And so we need to figure out how to do this cross pollination system where they get to touch finance and accounting and learn about how the business works, and learn about, if they're a geologist, how processing works, or whatever area, right? And just give them some exposure. But I also think a really interesting concept that I have been reading a bit more about in other industries, of course, is something called a returnship. So we have this amazingly knowledgeable senior workforce that, miners don't retire. They love what they do. They always want to do it, and so let them come back. So instead of an internship, have a returnship, hire the green person, bring back the person that worked there for however long, or 20 years ago, but still knows all about the mine, and give them that institutional and like historical knowledge point and somebody to be a fail safe, because the rest of your leadership and management is stretched so thin. And, more senior individuals going to be dying to impart all of their knowledge and stories and information on somebody that's just coming in. And mining people tell great stories. And so it's sort of like, that's a retention strategy in itself. Like, all of a sudden they've like bought into all of the stuff that we've told them and all of the interesting history of it. And it's sort of like magic could be made in that area. So I'm a huge advocate for returnships and cross training and figuring out how to do this. But also, you and I have talked about this, but Alex Mashenko and I also have talked about this, and figuring out a way to bring in talent from the military, because one, they've been in some seriously strange places and worked under some very hard conditions, and they understand leadership and teamwork, and all of that parlays really well to what we do. And so maybe the three of us have to figure that out.
Yeah, and even down to like the hard skills, right? Like the military has, equipment mechanics. They've got folks that build runways and roads, right? They have engineers. They have a whole corps of engineers just in the army, right? Like, they've got environmental engineers and scientists. They've got doctors. They've got lawyers. They've got HR people, right? But they have so many like MS, all these different skills where it seems like such a logical thing. You even have groups that are used to having to relocate their family for a job, right? To
Yep.
a totally different place where they don't know anybody,
Yep.
right? So you've got a lot of things that might really, I think, work really well and give the industry a wonderful, pool of people that could be really passionate about what's going on there. It's in general a group of folks that understand why it's important
Yep.
to have domestic resources or to have like secure supply chains of material for US national security and just the general, world at large being a more stable place. They tend to understand that those things are important and that there's all these different pieces that fit into that. And I think, yeah, so at some point, I hope we can figure out how to do that. I think partly it's again the companies saying, yes, please give us, we're open to a new pool,
Yep.
right? And might take some learning and some coaching on how to kind of match up how the military articulates this skill set versus how we're used to seeing it on a resume, right? But we can manage those things. Those are fixable problems,
Those
right?
are infinitely fixable problems.
Put it all in ChatGPT.
Oh my God. Well, so going there, since you said it, I feel like the way that we can upskill and educate is so vastly different now than it was 20 years ago, where you had to go and get an MBA, where you had to go and stretch yourself in a lot of these different areas. The idea of being able to upskill learn other parts of mining if you're already in it, and be, prepared. We just have tools at our disposal now that radically change what the learning curve and how we learn can look like. And that should be something that we're utilizing more often, right? From just getting into an organization and having an orientation with this detail. But plus, like, hey, I'm a board geologist and I'd like to do something else. Like, okay, here's some classes. Like, there's a lot of ways that we can lean into AI and all of these other areas so that we can subsidize this talent pool in a way that's really meaningful for far less of a cost than we've had in the past, I think. So,
Like making it accessible globally also, right?
yeah,
Because I think so often, at least at mining conferences in Toronto and Denver, and like there's when you think of the mining industry, we think of people in like North America,
yeah,
right? Like there are super qualified people all over the world where mining is a more like an industry that people still are really eager to work in,
yeah,
right? That you can pull in different ways. I know even at Prospector for our, all of our data goes through a QA, QC, it goes through the AI, but there's always a human that reviews everything, and they're always a geologist or mining engineer. And we've gotten great people to work on that remotely from all over the world,
yeah,
right? Because, they all speak geology, they all speak mining, no
yeah.
matter where they're located. And I think that's the other thing that folks forget about is when you talk about in training and leveraging technology, it really widens the pool of who you can pull from in a bunch of different ways.
Well, I think also cost considerations, right? Like the ability to have somebody working remotely and traveling as needed. That's a very different scenario than having to pay for relocation for them and their families, or to have their spouse not be able to work wherever they are. So, some of the traditional asks that we've had in mining, I think, can be sort of, there are solutions around what that looks like at this point, as you're saying. And this year, I guess last year, so end of 2024, we thought, let's just dabble in the idea of creating a salary survey. So, really, in a very limited capacity, we rolled it out to individuals through our database, through our network, et cetera. And to be perfectly honest, the numbers are the numbers. But what you can like extrapolate from some of the questions that we asked with those numbers is how many individuals had opportunity to work remotely. And this absolutely blew my mind, because I think we historically think of mining as being sort of rigid in this, but 60+% of respondents to our salary survey said that they had some remote or flexible or hybrid working arrangement. Over 60%. And I thought, and this covers from entry level through board. And I thought, wow, that was far more than I anticipated hearing in that. And there were lots of other insights, and we haven't rolled this out quite yet, but like that one was really encouraging to me. And even some of our clients, as I'd mentioned, Freeport, they have project managers that are 100% remote. Like there's all kinds of really interesting things that we can do leaning into some of the technology that we now have. And so I'm loving that part of where we're going.
Well, and I think it also, on the flip side, having worked in a lot of emerging and frontier markets, like you can also upskill local populations, right? In the same way, right? So there's this tendency in a lot of groups where they expect that they're going to have to import management from certain places, and then maybe over a certain period of time, like, pull back on that and it's more local management. But it's like there's a lot of other really creative stuff you can do, even domestically in the US. Like I was just talking to the South 32 team about their plans for the Hermosa project, and like the local employment commitment that they've been able to make in those communities because they've integrated so much high tech, like automation, new stuff into how they're going to build that mine. It allows for a much higher local employment because they can have people working at a kind of remote operations center,
Yeah.
right? Like, so they can employ a much higher percentage of that local community than if they were using a traditional kind of mine building or mine planning approach. And I think that's the case in a lot of other places too, where a lot of the kind of community, the first benefits the community see from having a mining company in the area is, of course, employment. So
Yeah.
what can you do to leverage technology and upskilling and all of this stuff in a different way to have a much larger percentage of your team be from the communities that you're working in, right?
Well, and with
Um,
that, they've become perhaps, if we do this right, advocates for the industry, right? And so I think that that's another consideration. And how do we create a sustainable, non-sustainable industry, right? As an extractive industry, it's not necessarily the most sustainable. And we use that word, and I always scratch my head about it. But like, how do we create a sustainable workforce? How do we create a scenario where we're contributing, schools and water and infrastructure and all the things that need to happen in a way that's meaningful and impactful and leaving a positive remembrance when it's done, right? Because the life of mine may not go forever. So it's sort of like, okay, now they have a different skill. They've got all this other stuff at their fingertips. And when we do it right, I think we have immense capacity to just have a much better reputation. And so, as we look at changing some of what we're doing, and legislature is changing rapidly at this point, maintaining the focus on doing things appropriately needs to be there because we don't have any more runway to screw up.
No, and I think this is where also having done mining in places where what we were doing, like in Afghanistan in particular, was a part of a larger economic development strategy,
Yeah.
right? I think it's also important for companies to think about what else can you actually invest in local communities that creates a resilient local economy when the mine shuts down. Right. I mean, some of the cool things I've heard folks talk about is like, okay, you're reopening this underground mine in a beautiful mountain area, like put a local ski slope in, right? If you're going to be housing your staff, like make the staff housing area into a really cool building that can be turned into a boutique hotel afterwards, right? Like you can do things that are smart investments that also leave a community more resilient, because I think that's what sometimes, and it's the same problem that's made in like the development space a lot. It's just like immediate, makes you feel great, buying books for the library, opening schools, digging wells, but it's like, okay, but who's going to pay for all that stuff
Yeah.
after this business, right? Like that doesn't increase the resiliency of the community if the whole economy of that area is still just built around the mine, right?
Well,
It's
I
not
think
easy.
that we've seen, I guess I'll try to figure out how to say this the best way. I was really encouraged for the last several years to see as much headway as we did and conversation around large ESG programs and community and government and how all of that sort of gets integrated into what you're talking about. And the sheer fact is that it's expensive. It's expensive to hire the individuals to strategize that, or the firms or whatever. And although we've got all these protocols, none of them are aligned globally. And so sometimes it makes sense to a degree to one or the other. But what I have recognized in the last probably 2 years is that they're retracting on some of the big long-term promises and visions that they had when they finally start to recognize the cost to the organization, to the mining company that they would have to incur, and trying to balance that with the investors and other things. We're seeing some of that roll back. And I have had a handful of calls in the last really 6 months, unfortunately, where they've said, like, my position's getting cut, or I got to this point and I'm not going to see it happen. So it's time for me to move on or whatever. And I hate that. Right. I mean, it's really, really hard. And so I don't have a solution for that, but I would love to see some kind of standardization. I mean, it's never going to happen globally, but it would be great to see some adherence to doing what we say and to a standard, so that one set of companies are not held to one that's drastically different than the other, or whatever. So I don't know. I think that boils down to vision and money and how it all works into the greater play of things. But that's been rough.
Yeah, and I think that does go back inevitably to vision and leadership, right? Because there's always a way to do things the right way. It's just a matter of making leadership choices, right? So if that really is what the company and the team is committed to, then I'm sure there are other things that may have to be sacrificed in order to accomplish whatever that objective is. And I think that's where consistent and following through is really hard, right? Because it's real easy when you've just got a bag full of money and you can spend it
Yeah.
on whatever that's not a true test of leadership, right?
Right.
Or even management. It's when resources are constrained and you don't have everything you need. like what do you do then?
Yep.
Right? What is it that you're cutting and reducing in order to keep your core mission alive? So I think that's also where personally I'm always interested, like how many of these groups ever go out and recruit entrepreneurs?
Yeah.
Because those are the decisions that you and I have to make every day. And it's like, I think that's another area where the industry misses a unique, and maybe they do, and I just don't know. But, it's not often that you see somebody in industry who is recruited for a senior position who's led a startup. You don't even see people who have led juniors get pulled into leadership at larger companies, right? Which you would think would be kind of a common thing, right? So it's like all of the skills that you need in order to make hard choices, fail fast, recover even faster, like
Yeah.
all of those things, raise money, manage, multidisciplinary technical teams, like all of that is found within the entrepreneurship space. And yet there doesn't appear to be much crossover even from that, you know?
Well, I mean, ask yourself the question, would you want to go do that for a major?
Paid me enough money. Yeah. And
Okay,
if I have
that's
to do
that's
whatever I want
probably
to
the
do.
answer that most entrepreneurs, including myself, would say. Like, okay, if it was lucrative, if there was something that I absolutely believed in, but like, would you have the autonomy? Would you have the capacity to lead in the way that you're accustomed to when you're responsible for as many people as you're responsible for? Like, of course you could go and do it, but would you want to? And I think that that's where we stop seeing that possibility come to fruition. And it doesn't mean that it is never going to happen, because I think I'm probably optimistic. Like I said, we're going to have less people to choose from. We're all going to have to make different choices. I don't know what's going to happen politically or whatever that's going to change some of that, but like I think that we're sort of on the precipice of a lot of really interesting things in our industry, and I would rather be optimistic than pessimistic about that, what that looks like. But I agree with you. I think that the skill set of an entrepreneur, I think the skill set of individuals who have had to figure it out, skill sets from individuals out of military, I think they naturally lean into those sorts of challenges and rise to the occasion more so than ones that perhaps have a lot of insulation around them, and don't understand the broader ramifications of what's going on.
Yeah, or we're just gonna the folks kind of on the outside or at some point are gonna build a critical mass and create something completely new and different, right? Which I think is also a really valid
Yep.
scenario with what the industry is headed towards. I think it almost looked like that with Cobalt,
Yep.
right? And now I'm like, oh, now you're just an African mining company. Sorry, Kurt. Sorry, I'm teasing, but like, it kind of looked like this fundamental shift in the business with the amount of money that came in behind it and what they said they were going to do. And I think at some point it may just be like a group of people that are able to tell the story different, paint a different picture, have vision and leadership and all those things finally get matched up with investors that are attracted to that, that creates a completely different alternative
Yep.
to what's been going on, right? Because I don't think it's sustainable. I don't think that there is that kind of demand on either side to kind of incrementally change things enough where, just a great, in my mind, it's like there's so much that could be learned. For example, for big mining companies that are hiring a CTO, a chief technology officer, they should be bringing in startup tech entrepreneurs, right? Because that's like what you want, right?
Yep.
You want somebody on the company side that understands what startup and new tech looks like. How do you evaluate it? How do you help build it? How do you customize all that stuff, right? And on the flip side, if there are tech companies that are trying to get into the mining space, they should be recruiting out of the mining industry, right? And you don't see that either,
Nope.
right? So that's not happening. And that's where I always say, like, my personal mantra is like, well, if they weren't going to give me a seat at the table, I'll just go build my own effing table, right? Like, and invite the folks that I want to eat dinner with. And like they can leave the other table if they want, or they can be other folks that weren't invited to sit at the other table, right? But we're gonna have a great party. I think that's it, and it's not an easy option, but I kind of think that's where we'll hit critical mass of folks that really do passionately believe it's important to do something different and find the folks that are willing to write the checks for something different, and then you might just see something kind of new and magical happen.
Well, I think that that's a really good point, and I will absolutely sit at your table if I'm invited and figure out what others to invite. But, I think that is as good a vision as we can come up with to solve all of the world's problems. So I think our mission is complete, Emily.
Done. One
Done.
podcast.
Wash my hands of it. We can be done for the week. We figured it all out. No, I think we can go around and around and talk about all the possible interesting things, but like, I don't know. That for me sums it right up because that's what we need to do.
And it's hard, but I think it's the entrepreneurs, frankly, in this space. And entrepreneurship can look like a lot of different things, right? And it could be single consultants, it could be startup folks, it could be all kinds of different things. It could be juniors. I would consider most junior exploration companies are startups, right?
Yep.
They are, I think it's just at some point in you just have to say, I remember this hit me after a very specific meeting at the Pentagon back in my days there, where you always think there's this group of super smart people out there, like figuring stuff out. And then you realize, oh, wait, it's us. We're the group that's supposed to be figuring it out,
Yep.
right? Like nobody else is going to fix this problem. It's
Yep.
not going to be the ICMMs. It's not going to be the BHPs and the Rios and the Barracks. That's not who's going to figure this out because they're not the ones that see the problem in the same way that we all do, right? They've got other things that they're focused on figuring out
Very
realistically.
much. Well, they also don't experience the problem in the same way, right? And I think that that's where the idea of figuring out how to collaborate between large and small and help, as you said early on in our conversation, sort of give some insulation to those who are experiencing the most vulnerability and the most risk in this cycle of what we're referring to as mining, is what we sort of have to do. And, one of the other ideas that I've heard a lot more recently is sort of this vertical integration company where they start and basically wind up being producers because and understanding the supply chain and getting it all out there, right? Because they're in control of the entire thing and perhaps are recognizing some different cost considerations and other things. But like that is a really interesting concept. And I think that perhaps we'll see more of that. And I think you were talking a little bit about that, but it's something that I've heard more than once recently. And so I think that should be interesting to watch. But I talked to another individual, Rob Carpati, recently, and he's really more on the artisanal mining side and trying to look at small mining. And there have been a number of companies that have cropped up around that. And, the big ones are like, oh, it's just absolutely inefficient. You'll never be able to do all this stuff. But like, at the end of the day, the market still needs these things. And so how do we figure out ways of accomplishing this, right? Like, does that mean that like forever we only shop at Walmart, or do we still go to a mom and pop shop? Like there's room in the marketplace for all kinds of ideas and ways to solve problems, et cetera. And so I don't know that there is a rule of thumb to make any of this work. It's just that we need more innovation, period.
We got to get out of like this scarcity mindset where there's only so much money out there that we're all going to fight for. There are only so many good projects out there. There are only so many good people out there, and we're all fighting for it, right? And got to get into, I forget what the flip side of, it's like one of those what is it? Scarcity and abundance.
Yep.
It's like there is so much stuff out there. And what that reminds me of is, the artisanal mining kind of conundrum that a lot of places have. Another cool, really fun thing about Guyana is that like small scale mining is legal there and is a huge part of their economy. Like
Yep.
before the offshore oil and gas discovery, like gold exports were their largest GDP or largest export
Wow.
percentage. Right? And it's for such a small country, it's like 800,000 people in Guyana. It's like 30 to 50,000 people work in the mining industry, right?
Wow.
So you can percentage of the population that is intimately connected with
Yeah.
what mining is, why it's important. They work in it, they know it, their family knows it, right? And it's so refreshing because when you're there, even if you're talking about something that folks haven't done before, like airborne geophysics or something like that, they understand the value of what you're doing. To me, I'm like, it's the only country I've ever worked in where that scale of mining is legal and supported by the government. And in fact, a big part of what we're doing there is trying to bring in technology and tools and exploration methodologies to help the local mining industry, right, at the artisanal, small and medium scale. And like, so it's the only time where it's been legal and embraced, and it changes fundamentally how you approach mining in a country when you do that,
Yeah.
right? Because it's a huge constituency for, for the politicians, rightly so. It's a big industry in the country. So they have a voice. They want, to articulate why their industry is important and how they want help and what they do and don't want and all those important things that so often is not the case.
Yeah.
Right. So again, this idea that, well, when we talk about mining in emerging markets, we're talking about big companies going in. No, like you're talking about, massive amounts of people that make their living every day, feed their kids every day, pay their school fees every day off of mining. And those people have an incredibly rich, important role to play in our global industry and bring a lot of expertise and understanding and know-how,
Yeah.
right? And they're going to be a big part of what the next version of this industry looks like, because I don't think it's going to just go back to big companies running everything. I think we're way past that.
I joked with somebody recently and I said, well, why don't we get these individuals who have literally learned about mining for generations in all these areas that hasn't destroyed their communities, that hasn't eaten into their water system, that everything is going quite well. Have them come over to the US and help us with our community relations and some of our permitting and some of all the rest of the stuff, because they speak a very different, not language from like an actual language standpoint, but like the reason for it, right? And we lean on the same sorts of ideas over and over. But if you bring somebody in that says, look, there's been mining in my community for hundreds of years, and in fact, my family and I all do some of it, as we choose, that changes other people's perspectives. And I'm like, why are we not leaning on people who get it and know how to talk to communities and influence them in a way, and I think we're doing better and better in that area and getting more skilled at it. But I would just love to see utilization of individuals who actually have experienced it in some of these functions.
Yeah, and so often it's because, again, it goes back to that scarcity mindset. If a local community is mining an area, then a big company can't go in and just own all the land and own all the resources. You're right. They
Yeah.
can't. They're going to have to figure out a different model. That's what's interesting, again, about the companies that are doing really well in Guyana, the kind of foreign or publicly traded companies, like, because they've had to work with these local landholders, local claim holders. And yeah, is it challenging sometimes? Absolutely. But is that the way that they're going to be successful there? Yeah, right. And I think it's, again, goes back to you oftentimes have very different people involved in that process than you do in a kind of standard mining exploration program, because they've had to bring in folks that can do things differently.
Well, I feel like the message of our podcast today is doing things differently and thinking about it in a way that has perhaps not an abundance mindset, but like one that is evolving in that direction.
You don't go into it with the mindset that you can do it all differently, then it's always easier to do it the same way it's always been done. So it's almost like you have to in my opinion,
Yeah.
and really say, no, I'm going into this with the assumption that I will have to do this totally different than I've ever done it before, and then find ways to pull in what worked, right? And I guess in that way, certainly when you're trying to raise money, you've got to go into an abundance mindset, because you get told so much that you got to remain
Resiliency is important.
that's what John and I at Prospector, when we were having this conversation about what are the core values of the folks that we want to have on our team. Both of us grew up in very similar ways in rural Maine, working our way through school and all that stuff. And we settled on grit.
Yeah.
Grit is super important. I guess another more mining word, resiliency, but
Well,
yeah.
I love that one. And, I've worked with an individual through a few companies now. So he's been on all sides of my workflow. So he was a candidate early on, and in fact was the first person I ever toured a mine with. And so I learned an enormous amount. And at the time it was Baghdad mine and still is Baghdad, but that was the first mine I ever toured. And he's a metallurgist. And so I had a chemistry lesson. I got to tour all this stuff. And, eventually he moved on from Freeport and he's much more on the entrepreneurial side at the juncture of his career. And so we've stayed in touch and I've worked for him as a client, I think a few times. And I always ask the question, like, what do you want to see in individuals that I'm bringing to the table? Let's talk about some of the other stuff. I can read the job description, but let's go into other stuff because it's always more exciting anyway. And the one word he always uses is tenacity. So you have grit, he has tenacity, and absolutely embodies that in all of the best possible ways from my perspective. But, I think we have such a cool group of people, and we all have a different sort of flair and flavor and word that we might describe ourselves. But I think every company should take a few minutes to think about what are some of their core values. And if they're not putting them in writing and talking about them through interviews and all of, you will never have alignment. You won't build the team that you need to have if you don't go into an interview and be like, how would you describe yourself? And like, I loved your thing the other day that you posted, like, ChatGPT told me that I would be a whatever. And so ours was wolf. And I'm like, I'll absolutely get on board with this because, back in the day when I had to date, I always asked individuals that I dated, I was like, what kind of animal would you be? And there were some weed out questions or answers, I should say. But now I think I'm going to have to ask my clients. It's like the same thing. What would describe you?
Well, I always loved when I was back doing the stuff with IBM as a recruiter. My question that I got from a senior IBM person was he would make these new grads, right? Really, they were all like seniors in college still,
Yeah.
right? So recruiting, be like, tell me a joke. And the poor kids, they would
It
all
just
like,
frees up.
"No,"
Oh
right?
God.
Because jokes you can think of at that moment in time, of course, are completely inappropriate to
Oh, of
tell
course.
a job interview. But he would say like that told him more
Yeah.
about like how someone handled the kind of awkwardness of the moment or how they kind of talked their way out of it or what joke they came up with told him so much about what that person would be like as a colleague. And,
I love
it's like I've kept that up. Yeah.
Well,
So it makes
after,
a cheesy, very PG joke so that if anybody ever asks me, I've got one in my back pocket.
well, what is your joke?
What do you call cheese that somebody else is?
Nacho cheese.
Nacho cheese.
Oh, well, my 5-year-old apparently is a really good joke teller and loves jokes. And he tells me, Mom, you want a joke? And I'm like, sure. So he gives me all kinds of them and he remembers them. But, so that now makes me remember jokes that are not wildly inappropriate, which I'm grateful for at this point of my life. And his favorite joke is, how do you make a tissue dance?
I don't know how.
Put a little boogie in it. So that would have to be my.
For all your listeners out there,
You've got
remember.
2 jokes to remember and understand that you need to have be able to describe yourself as an animal and justify why. And evidently my screening criteria has just gone off the rails.
But I think when you put this out like on social media, what we want to hear, LinkedIn or YouTube or wherever, everybody else put your appropriate job interview jokes in the comments or whatever animal you would be.
Yes, those 2 things. And if you could describe your organizational value in one word, or what would it be? Because, we have to flip it to the clients as well. So those are our 3 asks of the day. But on that note, I've kept you like a bazillion years. So, we could go on and make everybody, take a road trip to listen to this, or we could call it.
We'll just save the rest of it for another episode then.
Part 2.0. But, I've sort of come full circle. So my very first podcast was yours.
That's right. Yeah. And you were
Yeah, well, I'm very green at it. And so here we are multiple years later. I don't even know when that was, 2021 or something like that. And now it's 2025. So you've had like a bazillion episodes and are obviously well versed at this. But thank you for being here. And it's always so much fun. And I'm waiting for our next dinner where we can have wildly inappropriate joke telling and other things.
anytime, every dinner time with me. That's usually on the agenda. Yeah.
Well, I'll be counting it down. So are you going to the same conference this year?
I'll be at the last day of Minds and Money Miami. I'll be coming back into Miami, so I'll see some folks there. And then I'll be at PDAC, of course. Other than that,
I'll see you there.
Running around the jungle a good part of the spring. So yeah,
Wow.
But I'll see you at PDAC and we'll see you at the party, the mining party, hopefully.
I will be there. It was the first one I RSVP'd to. So you're stuck with me. But anyway, thank you again for being here, Emily. It's such a pleasure. And I will talk to you soon.
So, thanks for having me.
Of course.